Now, what is the definition of a man, and according to whose standards can we define a man? Consider the fact that in ancient times, boys were initiated from the age of 7 until the age of 77 years. And the purpose behind this was to teach them the entire spectrum of character, which involves 144,000 perfect attributes, and these are related to 144,000 prototype plants and animals. And these are also symbols or manifestations of the spirit. And so the whole purpose of initiation was to teach the average child how to master their own character, so that as adults they may be responsible citizens within their community. Actually, we might say that this culture was deliberately left behind in favor of us experimenting with what we have become, the human being. Meaning that this form of initiation eventually came to an end and was reserved for certain tribes, which are found throughout Africa. And basically, according to some research or some initiates who are familiar with this knowledge, only 12 tribes were elected or selected to be the custodians of this knowledge. The rest of us received an inferior version of this knowledge, which was designed to help us understand our role in society, as well as our attributes as human beings, as to what defines a man compared to a male. Given that we live in a world now which is characterized by poverty, suffering, inequalities, and many of these things, and you might say that initiation basically deals with information, because to initiate someone, we introduce them to a certain set of rules as well as laws in order to help them belong within that society. And so in modern day Africa, or in this modern world, many of us are sent to school, meaning that we are first initiated into the Western system before we undergo traditional initiations. And the error here is that these Westerners are usually non-initiates, or they are initiated into their own world of materialism, which is characterized by money, greed, and many of the things which define our world today. And so basically, under normal circumstances, we would say that a man is characterized by character rather than belongings, because we live in a world where if you happen to own nothing, or let's say you don't have a wife, a house, a car, you may not really be defined as a man. But in reality, some of the people who may lack these things are nothing more than victims of this inhuman world. And some of those who have earned these things have subscribed to this world due to their abilities to sell out, or one might even say they've been able to compromise many of their characters. Because we can actually agree to the fact that Westerners didn't get to where they are today using morals. Instead, they adopted violence as well as deceit. So much that we live in a world where there's military, the judiciary, and according to moral standards, a man shouldn't have a lawyer speaking on his behalf. A man should always speak for himself. And a world which would have prisons, which would keep someone for almost a lifetime behind bars for a certain offense, regardless of the fact that we human beings are imperfect beings, and many of our activities are a reflection of our society. And so this eventually describes the manner in which we have surrendered our manhood for the sake of belonging, because many of us do not necessarily have character but have belongings, and due to this we are considered men. And whereas in reality, no real man would live in a world of poverty and not challenge that. And man being a universal concept based on morality, in other words, spiritual attributes, this would mean that for us to be real men, we have to end poverty, inequality, as well as gender discrimination. But this is not the case with our world, because we live in a world of fears, which are characterized by militaries, where we have trained professional assassins to help us deal with our fears of the uncertainty. And yet in ancient times, the whole purpose of initiation was to help us open up our pineal glands, so that we can perceive the so-called future as well as the past. Thus understand that time exists in what science could, or quantum physics could define as superposition, meaning that all events simultaneously occur. But due to our lack of superior intellectual commands. In other words, due to our inability to access the depths of our intelligence, we find ourselves locked in this world of linear time where we finally become aware of the future or the unknown. And these fears characterized by these militaries, by excessive wealth, which some might see as a sign of greed. And so what really would define a man in a world where there would be inequalities, corruption, and we all subscribe to this world which was developed from violence, deceit, and many of these negative principles which still govern our world. And so in short, one would say that the universal man has ceased to exist, and we live in a world where we're nothing but more than males who are manipulated by the system for the sake of survival, hoping to buy our existence by compromising our attributes or moral standards for the sake of getting jobs, being considered normal, etc. And yet in reality, a man would speak his mind regardless of the consequences. And many of our so-called presidents or great men whom the world has presented to us as role models, having dealt with some of the issues which would be troublesome for the ruling elite, including whites. And so the whole idea of us being men needs to be questioned based on the fact that it's rooted on compromises as well as fears and greed. And real men wouldn't subscribe to such low moral standards. So are women. So much that many of the so-called educated black men and women will shave their heads bald and marry a woman who wears a wig, in other words, fake extension. A woman who's no longer attached to to her culture as well as nature, a rebel of natural circumstances. And so the definition of a modern man needs to be questioned before we can move forward as a human race, because we seem to live in a world of compromises where these actually outplay themselves out in reality as poverty, inequality, and many of our troubles. And so the purpose of this video was to question our stance concerning moral standards and concerning us being whether we're still men or can we just be defined as males, because there's a serious difference between a man and a male. So much that culturally in Africa we consider a man as someone who has gone through initiation. And yet if we look to certain tribes within the same continent, some of our tribes go through this form of initiation at the age of 7 years old, or as early as 7 or 8 days of their birth, meaning that our description of a man is questionable when you consider the entire human race. Furthermore, one cannot be a man by traditional standards alone, because being man is a universal concept. By that, I'm trying to say that you cannot be a traditional man who goes to find employment within the Western system, which requires them to sacrifice their moral standards and work for these white men who didn't go through the same initiation rites and have no regard of us as human beings as well as life itself. And so the idea of us being men today needs reassessment in order for us to change, because it's a very sensitive subject, because no one wants to be regarded as a lesser man, and yet we find ourselves operating as such. And so I would like us to reconsider these notions concerning our allegiance to this corrupt, evil system, which was presented to us by white men, using violence, among other things, who sacrificed our ancestors in order to give us this junk civilization which does not benefit us all. And yet we claim we are real men, but yet we are so tolerant of these evils. So much that we live in a world where there's racism, gender inequalities, and discrimination. And a man wouldn't allow any other man to go through poverty and be a laughing stock for kids as well as women. And so the idea of us being universal men is long gone and needs further assessment before we deteriorate to the levels below those of animals. My name is Mtunzi Masoga, and this is my take on manhood, and especially the idea of a universal man, which I believe is a concept of the past.